Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questo nuovo appuntamento delle Lingue Live. Vi porto i saluti anche di Laura Cavaleri, la responsabile di Area Lingue, che di solito siete soliti veder presentare questi webinar, che per un impegno lavorativo, un imprevisto, non potrà essere con noi, quindi vi porto anche i suoi saluti. Vi ricordo alcune cose proprio burocratiche per questo webinar prima di iniziare il nostro percorso insieme oggi pomeriggio. Potete inserire le vostre domande nella chat di YouTube e alla fine saremo felici di dare alcune risposte se vorrete. È previsto un attestato di partecipazione per questo webinar e sarà disponibile nei prossimi giorni sul sito rizzolieducation.it alla pagina attestati, esattamente come le slide che verranno utilizzate oggi in questa diretta. Tutti i link, tutte le cose che vedrete nelle slide saranno scaricabili a breve dal sito che vi ho detto prima. Per chi vedrà questo evento in differita, l'attestato sarà disponibile solo ai partecipanti che avranno effettuato l'accesso dalla mail di conferma di iscrizione entro la mezzanotte di oggi. La registrazione di questo video però resterà disponibile sul canale YouTube Rizzoli Education allo stesso indirizzo al quale lo state vedendo in questo momento. E se desiderate essere informati circa la programmazione delle nostre dirette, potete iscrivervi al canale YouTube Rizzoli Education premendo il tasto iscriviti. Oggi parleremo di impero, geografia, di Geography of Empire è il titolo del webinar di oggi, e insieme al mio amico e collega, il professor Leonard O'Shea, che adesso vedete comparire, faremo un viaggio geografico, storico, letterario, culturale attraverso l'impero, partendo dalle mappe e arrivando a romanzi, poesie e letteratura. Io vi auguro un buon webinar, una buona visione, un buon ascolto e lascio la parola al mio collega che inizierà con noi questo percorso.
Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to our webinar. We're going to be talking, as we said before, on the geography of empire. Geographers were often at the avant-garde of imperial presence in the world, frequently and most often of colonization. The theories that they came up with and helped provide justification of empire, both from on behalf of the conquerors and, ironically, on behalf of also the conquered. The diligence that they had to show on mapping and exploration, pinpointing potential resources and the means of their exploitation and trade. For better or for worse, geographers, along with anthropologists, described and interpreted the cultures that were colonized and taken under any imperial control, and through different publications then informed the perceptions of the world for centuries and centuries in their own home countries. We're going to be talking about specifically geography and the British Empire. Okay, there we go. So the start of the empire. The start of the empire began during the Elizabethan age. The English Empire at that time designated the associations only between England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Ireland being the only overseas property or colony of the British Empire of that time. During the 15th and the 16th centuries, the English explorers were going out into the world, but the age of discovery, the Spanish and Portuguese were pioneering European exploration all over the world. Excuse me. So the Spanish Armada of 1588, where the Spanish king wanted to impose Catholicism onto England, ironically provided the impetus for the British explorations later. The disastrous attempt of invasion allowed the English to capture a very large amount of Spanish and Portuguese ships. And they used these ships then under the commands of such explorers such as Raleigh and Frobisher. Frobisher being going towards North America and Canada, and Raleigh going to South America, would allow the expansion of the British Empire further. The first ship that was sent to India, first ship to India was under the command of Raleigh, and he basically went out there raiding Spanish and Portuguese ships. And in 1594, they returned to England with a very important document. They discovered, they took over and attacked a Portuguese carrack called the Madre de Deus, and this carrack created or gave them the opportunity to steal. Let's put it. Let's be blunt about it. They stole the Mariner's Handbook containing the maps and charts of the trade routes that the Portuguese were using to go to China. So the initial start of the English expansion into the East came from information being taken from the Portuguese. So at that stage, they continued on towards Japan and China via India. But obviously there was no sovereignty. Sovereignty being defined as the absolute authority in the decision-making process of the state. The continued explorations then of Frobisher towards the North Atlantic, and then the colonization, being the most famous, being the first of the Mayflower, during the 17th, 17th and 18th centuries, created a network of territories stretching from Maine, Boston, New England, south, and then further down into the Caribbean. Unfortunately, under a series of wars, then obviously the British control of North America was lost at the War of Independence in 1783, but they kept Canada and the Caribbean. We will talk later about these particular places. Along this stage as well, the Navigation Act of 1650 created the Navigation Act actually just said that only English ships could import to Britain or Ireland, and no exports from any colonies transmitted through England would be allowed by any other thing. It created a vast monopoly, and by the very nature created the hub of the empire, the West Indies, to become extremely powerful and lucrative. This lucrative financial and economic power was born basically because of the slave trade and the slave triangle. Of course, you can see by the diagram there that the slave triangle was essentially a movement of goods between West Africa, Caribbean, North America, and then to England itself. Slaves being taken from West Africa or being bought using goods coming from England, being taken to the plantations in Caribbean, and then the sugar, molasses, and all of the different raw products produced were shipped back to England. The Jamaica map that I've inserted into this is along the lines of the geographical ideas of the time, even though it's topographically accurate, and it does not allow a veneer. It gives a veneer of objectivity, but the plantations are symbolized by Negro towns. It's supposed to be, its concept is to be neutral, but in reality, it reflects the political prejudices of the imperialistic times. And further on, we will speak a little bit more, a lot about more about that. There we go. So the East India Company then came into power, or came to become part of the essential part of the English economy, and was founded in 1599. The East India Company was given a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. Therefore, all trade to India and what was into India, East Asia, China, etc., etc. Their ideas of colonization wasn't an invasion as such. None of the British Empire was founded on invasion. It was founded on trade. This is an important thing because it wasn't about armed invasion. The trading posts that they established along the coast of India were basically becoming simple trading points, and they were expanded out over a series of years. Trading agreements being made with the different tribal leaders, and then spread to the extent that in 1757, the East India Company itself owned the vast majority of the Indian subcontinent. It seized control. It had control of India, most of Southeast Asia, and Hong Kong. At its peak, the East India Company was the largest company in the world. It had half of all trade. It had control of half of all trade passing into through England and Britain. And it had an army itself, a private army of over 250,000 soldiers, which was in fact twice the British Army at the time. Okay. The 19th century marked the apex of the empire, when administration and policies changed to a much more sophisticated system. Before, it was based on simple trade agreements. Simple, when I say simple, and we will look at it in a little while, a lot of these trade agreements were extremely spurious, where a representative from the agreement or from the company would land and make an agreement with whoever was there. It might be a tribal leader, it might be a so-called representative of the tribal leader, but using this as a legal basis to take more land and expand their holdings within the country. The occupation was, for all intents and purposes, illegal. However, the 19th century then they came across with the administration and the policy changing to a much more sophisticated system of the establishment of colonial offices in these countries, and the establishment of a colonial service from London itself. So this means there was a coherent and discipline pressure was put on the idea of looking after the country themselves. We'll talk later about the Pax Britannica, but the British Empire then began to disintegrate shortly after the World War, and between actually the interwar period, and once again we'll be looking at it in a little while. Okay, when you consider the definition of geography itself, which means the study of physical features of the earth and atmosphere, human activity as an effect, and is affected by these, including the distribution of population and resources and political economic activities, you can understand that talking about these talking about the British Empire in a very short time under the umbrella of geography is actually very, very difficult. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be looking a little bit more at just the simple idea of the maps itself, rather than the whole gamut of geography. So if maps are the physical manifestations of geography, the power and geopolitical concepts, the whole idea of the map are linked to the purpose of the map. Who makes the maps decides what it's for. Behind the map maker, the cartographer, there's often a set of very important power relations, and deliberate distortions are commonly used to for advancing different agendas. If I could draw your attention to something that's happening at the moment, and I put down in the bottom right-hand corner, the Chinese in 2014, they issued this map, skewing the normal axis of the map, putting the South China Sea very close to the center, and making it become part of, giving it a massive emphasis. And this is, of course, to reflect and emphasize the inclusion of the 10-dot line, which China has decided to claim all of the sea. Unfortunately, it is called the South China Sea, and they have used this almost as the excuse for doing it, saying this is known as the sea, therefore it is ours, irrespective of the fact that there are a lot of different nations who have equal territorial claim over the sea itself. It's culminating at the moment in the development of the Spratly Islands in the middle of the China Sea, which is basically a seamount, and they are doing so. They are taking this over. So it's a very important idea. It's a very important idea to understand that how even today the imperialism is the manipulation of maps is an extent of the imperialistic ambitions of any country. So when we start off with maps, basically we're going to look at Mercator maps. Now, world maps in general since 1569 have been, for all intents and purposes, Mercator maps. Mercator maps are quite common, obviously. They're the maps we use all of the time, but they are obviously very much open to distortion. Now, the reason that we use Mercator maps is because of navigation. Navigation, it uses straight lines far more than it uses curved lines, and therefore it is easier for navigation to be visualized. Always the problem with any sort of 2D map is that we have to project a 3D globe onto it. So there was this was considered to be the case. And what happens then is that the focus becomes who was ever in the center of the map. Okay. The issue, obviously, with the Mercator map is that the further north you go, the more elongated the lines become, and so therefore Canada, in this case, becomes much larger than this, as does Russia. But the British Empire didn't care that much about the size of Siberia, but they did care about the extent of which Canada is perceived. Okay. Okay. Of all of the maps of the British Empire, the Imperial Federation map of 1886 is considered to be the encapsulation of British imperialism. It shows and showcases the British trade routes, as you can see around the different continents different continents, and it shows the projection of the British Empire itself. The empire of that time, and between that and the First World War, was its sheer size. At its height, obviously, the British Empire was 412 million people, which is 23% of the world population at that time, and 35.5 million square kilometers, which is 24% of the land area. The sheer size, there has never been an empire of the same size as that. The Imperial Federation map was brought around in 1885. It was made in 1885 for the colonial and Indian exhibition. It does show the economic flows and infrastructure of the empire, and it communicates very easily and factually the trade routes, etc. But it also shows a great explosion of peoples from across the empire. The figures itself, as you can see, it was also part of the cartographic art, was giving the cartographic art is in the surrounds of the map itself, with Britannia at the base of it, as you can see, and the different peoples of the empire spread around the sides. The depiction of these people is not as glorious as some people, or as the people at the time thought it was. The depictions of the Indians and the North American Indians, the trappers, in the top right or the top north, the top left-hand side corner, are above the successful and rich woman holding the furs, or dressed in the furs that the product of the people. In the bottom left-hand corner, there is an Indian man bent double over while carrying a large bale of cotton or of some sort of material, etc. You have also on the bottom right, you have Aborigines and Maoris with the Australian natives holding the kangaroo and a boomerang. What's more important, however, is the figure of Britannia herself, standing or sitting on the globe, where you can see Atlas holding the globe, with hard work being a part of the part written across his chest. A little bit imperialistic in itself. However, the irony of this is because a man who was called Walter Crane was the designer of this map, and he was a rabid socialist. And even though this was taken as one of the great idol or symbols in itself of the empire, it was also somewhat of a subversive statement. Oh. There we go. Perhaps, however, the most egregious examples of cartographic manipulation, as in taking a map and then deciding what it symbolized, was the land grabbing extent of the scramble for Africa in the 1870s and the 1880s, and the Berlin Conference on West Africa in 1884. The continuing the continuing expansion of the British Empire, the power that was controlled, the jealousy and control that each country also wanted because of the obvious benefits, and Africa became a symbol of this. It was the conference was the climax of a European competition in Africa, and which is basically a competition for Belgium for resources and prestige. In fact, Leopold II of Belgium, who had basically very, very little claim on anything of Africa, was inspired to increase all sorts of pressure just to be able to have some sort of colony that he could call Belgium. And he indeed, after long and hard negotiations at the conference, managed to secure a huge amount of land in the Belgian Congo, in the Congo, and then creating the Belgian Congo. He hired agents and incredibly spurious treaties to acquire all this land before even occupying these lands. He had never actually been there. Otto von Bismarck, because of all of this, of all of these different issues, even though he had no idea and was otherwise uninterested in Africa, as he had declared on many occasions, also felt compelled to stake claims. So inevitably, the conflicts between them, between the different imperial powers, France, England, Belgium, Germany, etc., and they came together to divide up the country, to divide up Africa. Whenever you see a straight line on a map, it is because it has been politically made. It takes into account it does not take into account any geographical centers, and it takes into account none of the indigenous people and what control that they needed to have. It ignored any sort of previous agreements that had been made, and therefore, divided up the African continent as it is there. In many ways, the countries took control of the territories, not because they were there, but because the map decided that they said they were there. Let's go on. The interwar years saw the largest extent of the British Empire. As the map shows, the red all over had been expanded because of the taking of the German the German and Ottoman Empire overseas colonies, and therefore it was possible to go from North Africa along the British Empire and never leave British controlled excuse me, territories. However, at this stage, the First World War had cost so much money, and it was so economically such an economically potent and problem for the British Empire, is that they began to lose control over their overseas properties. 1922, the Irish War of 1922, the Irish War of Independence, and so the Irish became the first countries to leave leave the British Empire, and this was followed then slowly by other countries that continued on. What happened because of this was because the control was slowly ceded back to the countries, and therefore in the Commonwealth was created, where the countries voluntarily decided that they would like to have some sort of continued association with the empire. 14 of them continued to keep the queen or the monarch as the head of state, although they had no political power. It was obviously a simple symbolic gesture. Other countries, as soon as they became republics themselves, then left the Commonwealth itself, and Ireland was one of these as well. The legacy of the British Empire is incredibly profound. They brought a lot of they influenced massively the world of the time. It's Pax Britannica during the 19th century, where the British Empire was basically the policeman of the world. And a general idea, a general atmosphere of peace and calm came across. The legacy, the bad part of the legacy is the entire empire was built on the use of and the threat of violence. The massive use of slavery and land theft. It would be very difficult to say that the British Empire would have existed without the idea of dominant slave and, as I said, thievery of land, spurious land agreements using paying off agents of different representatives of the country. There's also good things. The stable and political systems that were put into place and still remain in place. The idea of the rule of law, governmental organizations, infrastructures, which still remain today in many parts. The free trade agreement, which came around when the East India Company was finally taken over by the government in 1857. And free trade agreements were brought into place to allow the use and non-monopolization of transport. International money systems, where was the idea of the gold standard came into place, and which remained in place until the 1970s, where all currencies were basically reflected against the price of gold. And sports, soccer, rugby, tennis, golf, cricket maybe a little bit less than other places, but these were English sports that were then transported all over the world to have a profound effect on a modern society. And the very last one would be language. Language is why we're here today, because the most common second language of any is English in the world. It's the lingua franca. When you go anywhere else, if two people who are of different languages and or different nations, they will try most often to speak English as a common tongue between them. As I said, this is why we're here today. I'd like to thank you. This is my part done, and I'm going to pass you over to my friend and colleague Silvia, who will be looking into the literary tour.
Thank you, Leonard. So let's move to the literary side of the story. So at the climax of British imperial power, the relationship between literature and empire seems self-evident. The territorial expansion, as we've seen before, caused an explosion of English literature. They were not dealing with power, but with the idea of alterity. But since here we only have 25-30 minutes, I've decided to focus on one of the most varied and eclectic of the identity fields in literature, which is post-colonial literature, because it embraces a wide range of issues that go beyond colonial history. We will speak about justice, injustice, discrimination, identity, political activism, oppression, emancipation, inclusion and exclusion. So you perfectly understand why I've chosen this topic, because it's of great interest, of course, but it's great help when also we have to plan our lessons for Educazione Civica or CLIL lessons. So what is post-colonial literature? So let's make it simple, because today we have no time to go through the theories behind post-colonialism. So let's say that it is a quite new, relatively new category in which we encounter, I would say, a fascinatingly wide range of literary texts that come from different countries, different parts of the world that used to be colonies of an empire, in our case, the British Empire. Empire, sorry. I know it's a bit simplistic, but I want to focus on what we can do in class and not on the theories behind this, I know, controversial definition, because everyone has studied these theories before, or they can be found, everybody can find these theories online. So let's concentrate on what we can do in class. The first thing to do in class when we approach such a huge topic is to introduce, in my opinion, vocabulary, terms and ideas. And the first link you have here, it's an interesting TED Talk. And the speaker and well-known author speaks about stereotypes, and she focuses on the we versus them, mentality. The quotation I've chosen says that the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. So you can start from the experience your students have, because students can think about, probably there are single stories that others used to define them, okay? So why not start from our students' experience to understand the experience of other people? The second thing you have here on this slide is a completely different material. It's an essay by George Orwell that focuses on colonization from the perspective of somebody who participated in a colonial apparatus, I would say. And from here, you can try and find an answer for the question that's the title of my slides. Are good intentions enough? Because in some cases, colonizers had good intentions. But are good intentions enough? So after introducing these terms, the vocabulary, we can finally officially set sail for this tour. It will be short, but I hope interesting. So the first author we're taking into consideration, a Nobel Prize winning author, is Doris Lessing. So this book, The Grass is Singing, published in 1950, is set in a place that now is Zimbabwe. It was Rhodesia, okay? That country gained independence in 1965, then went back briefly to the United Kingdom and gained independence once again in 1980. So a super short summary for you. There are the two main characters are white immigrants, okay, in South Africa, and they fail to fit in both communities, the white community and the local community. And this leads to identity crisis and tragedy. So the passage I've chosen is a passage in which Mary, the white protagonist, you can find this passage on Litab by Rizzoli, and it's a passage in which Mary, the white protagonist, as I said, unexpectedly sees Moses, the black servant. So the words used to describe this meeting convey a sense of oppression and show the abuse of power of the white man over the blacks. The sentence that also was chosen, the phrase that was chosen as a title for this passage, implies that black people were not even considered ordinary people. Moreover, the title of the book, The Grass is Singing, is taken from The Wasteland by Eliot. So you can work on the parallelism with your students between the wasteland and Mary's life in Africa. So the fact that she hates the hot weather, the noise of cigadas, and the life in Africa. So there are a lot of interesting things to say about the title, but I want to go back to the theme I mentioned before, so identity crisis. Because identity is a very important topic in post-colonial world. A lot of writers and artists in general have looked for an answer to the question, who am I? And well, there's the reason for that. Colonialism and the legacy of colonialism have impacted identity formation and the construction of a new national identity after colonialism in Africa, but also Asia, the Americas, in every single part of the world that was colonized. So in class, we can start speaking about identity using a common passport or ID that show who we are. But this is a bit formal, you know, who we are, our name, the address, and whatever. But there's an activity I particularly like to speak about identity with my students when I approach this topic. And the activity is, I call it stand together if. Okay, for this activity, you need to clear some space so that students can stand in a circle. And you say sentences starting with stand together if. So for example, stand together if you speak more than one language at home. And invite all the students who speak more than one language at home to come into the center of the circle. So after a second or 2 seconds, they can go back and you go on. Stand together if you celebrate non-Italian festivity at home or whatever you want, okay? So with this activity, you can draw out themes about having different personal identities, being in majority or minority. That's fundamental to understand post-colonial literature. National identity versus personal identity, also fundamental to understand post-colonial literature. So in literature, examples of identity investigations, I would say, are millions, okay? There are lots of books speaking about identity, especially identity related to culture. When we speak about migrants, for example, the first book you have there, Ask Me No Questions. So this family from Bangladesh going to the United States and Canada, or people looking for a new identity after colonization. For example, the poem you have there by the Indian poet Bhatt. She also won the Commonwealth Poetry Prize for this poem. It's called A Different History. You have the link there. And she focuses on the problem of language that my colleague and friend mentioned before, and we are going to see it in a while. So which language, she says, has not been the oppressor's tongue? So focusing on a specific part, fundamental, I would say, part of identity. An interesting case is the Empire Windrush, as you know, the ship that arrived in Tilbury in 1948 with more or less 500 Caribbean migrants. So the question of personal identity and national identity is well presented in the novel you have there, even for lower level, Benjamin Zephaniah, Windrush Child. And well, they were migrants from a colony going to mother country, you know. So this story is particularly interesting because it shows what it was like to be a child of the Windrush generation. We could speak about identity for ages, but I would like to move on and to take into consideration another great author, South African author, Nadine Gordimer. So she's one of the most powerful voices against apartheid. She's also a Nobel Prize winning author, and she was a close friend of Nelson Mandela. Mandela used to read some of the books while he was in prison, even if some of the books, 3 of them to be precise, were banned in South Africa in that period. A particular event that is mentioned in the interview, you have the link, it's the first link in the slide. It's a great interview to use in class. There's a particular event that is mentioned in this interview that raised her awareness of injustice and division to other main topics, key topics of post-colonial literature. So she says that basically one night she saw the police searching her maid's room for liquor, which at the time was forbidden for Black people. So the passage I've chosen for you is taken from The Conservationist, a prose poem that was held for 10 weeks by the South African Censorship Board because it was considered dangerous. So a white woman, a white author speaking against apartheid, that was considered super dangerous. Again, a short summary for you. There is the typical white capitalist with colonial mentality who buys some land to relax, okay, after work. And the dead body of a Black person is found in that field. So the protagonist calls the police, who simply bury the body in that place, because there's no point, according to them, in wasting time investigating the death of a Black man. So this will lead to a radical change of the white protagonist. And you have a lot of topics in this prose poem. So death and violence, justice and injustice, richness and poverty, power and oppression. So these are some of the themes you can investigate with your students. So the web is full of resources to speak about apartheid. So you have some links there, but you can use basically whatever you want, starting from these novels. Okay, this one, but also other novels, because almost every single novel written by this author can be used to speak about apartheid. But what's interesting is that we said she was a political activist. So it's interesting, even in class, to speak about the end of apartheid and the struggle for equality. So you can divide the class into 4 groups. It's just an idea. And ask each group to investigate one of the events that led to the end of apartheid. So you have some material here for the 4 events I've chosen. Sharpeville, Soweto, the election of Leclerc. Oh, there's a typo, so sorry, Leclerc, okay, who repealed some of the harshest laws. And finally, the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994 that officially ended apartheid. Each group can fill a cause-effect chart, as the one you can see here. The cause is, of course, the historical event you've chosen for that particular group. And the effect will be the object of their investigation. And since, as I said before, Gordima was one of Mandela's friends, you can focus on the historical event you've chosen, starting from both her novels, but also newspaper articles. She wrote a wonderful obituary when Mandela died, and it's the link you have there. You can use it in class to speak about apartheid and the struggle for equality in South Africa. The quotation, the sentence you have, where you have the picture taken from the movie Invictus, is taken from this obituary. So Mandela, my friend and my countryman. So her novels are super interesting to speak about apartheid. Even if any form of racial discrimination in most countries is officially forbidden, the true, unfortunately, is another one. And with this poem, written by the poet from Nigeria, so playwright and writer, he's a poet, playwright, and writer, yes. This is a great poem, Telephone Conversation. It's a telephone conversation between a white woman and a black man. And it's a great one to do in class because it focuses both on the attitude of the white woman towards black people. So you can see, you can read. So she asks, how dark are you? Are you light or very dark? But at the same time, towards the poem, you can also see the anger of this black person towards discrimination. Okay. Since sometimes it's difficult to let our students understand what discrimination is, I suggest you an activity. You can do it as a warm-up activity or a final activity. You can tell the class that you've decided that everyone who is wearing blue jeans, okay, has to write a 4-page essay, and the rest of the class can watch a video on discrimination. For sure, students with blue jeans will start complaining, but no matter what, you ask them to work because you're the teacher and that was your decision. After 2 or 3 minutes, generally I choose a short video about discrimination. You can stop and start speaking about discrimination. So who is being treated unfairly? For the people who had to write an essay, how did you feel? What about the others? Was there in class a political activist who said something against this discrimination? Who complained? Who didn't complain? So you can speak about political activism starting from a real experience in class. So you can go back to Gordima or to this poem, Telephone Conversation, but it's a nice thing to do with students. In the last part, we have barely 10 minutes left. In the last part of this meeting, I'd like to speak about the rest of the empire, because Africa is, for some reasons, one of the most eclectic, I would say, post-colonial literatures, but even writers coming from other parts of the empire are worth our attention. So the Indian writer, super famous, Rushdie, writes a beautiful story that is a clear representation of the struggles of the colonized to assimilate into a dominant culture. So the dominant culture presents the idea, the allure of freedom, okay? But there are some barriers. And the first one is language. As we said before, language is one of the key elements of culture, identity, post-colonial literature. So the story is really personal because it draws from his own experience as an immigrant growing up in London. There are two main characters, the narrator, who is British, and the Indian teenager. And this last character, the Indian teenager, is used by the author to speak about the effort of former colonized people to fit into this dominant culture. And the result is a sort of hybridity, as Homi Bhabha calls it. Basically, hybridity is the creation of a third space, as he calls it. A third space formed by transcultural forms within the context zone produced by colonization. Okay, you can find some ideas about language and the relationship between languages and Great Inspiration, which is online, available for everybody, every colleague who has lit up. Well, language, as we said before, language has a key role, is a key element of post-colonial literature, is a key question. During colonization, colonizers usually imposed their language, as you can read in the quotation I've chosen. And in some cases, they systematically prohibited native languages. Think about boarding schools for natives in Canada, Australia, and so on. And using this policy, colonizers could complete and strengthen, I would say, the process of colonization. If it's true that colonialism facilitated indigenous cultural destruction, it is also true that during colonialism, new languages were created as different groups of people interacted. Think about pidgins and creoles, and today Haitian Creole is recognized as a language, an official language. On the other hand, the English language was affected by colonies. First of all, because we have a massive increase of speakers. So from 5 million to 250 million, so a massive increase. And we have borrowings from native indigenous languages. Think about words like boomerang and kangaroo taken from Aboriginal languages from Australia. Think about jungle and pyjama taken from Hindi. Think about totem or chocolate or chipmunk taken from indigenous American languages. So it's an interesting topic to take into consideration, starting from texts like the one by Rushdie. So these are always interesting topics. Even in the one I mentioned before, Ask Me No Questions, there's a huge reference to language and the language of people who were colonized. Well, 5 minutes. So India is the jewel in the crown, as we've heard before. But in the Americas, and I mean Canada, the US, the Caribbean, we're able to note that, well, the endurance, I would say, of colonialist practices as they relate to indigenous populations. Think about what's going on with indigenous populations in America and Canada, but also the so-called neo-colonialist system brought about particularly through the tourist industry. So here you have 3 examples. Example number 1 from Canada, The Marrow Thieves. It's a dystopian novel. It's a great novel with a lot of topics and themes you can investigate. Super short summary once again. Climate change decimates the world population. The survivors lose the possibility to dream, the ability to dream. Only Canadian Indigenous people can dream. And since they can still dream, they're hunted for their bone marrow. That's the title. Yes, it's fiction, of course. It's a dystopian novel. But it deals with the very real consequences of colonialism, such as the abuse of power, the exploitation, and moreover, there are references to native history and how tribal people's identity have been shaped by boarding schools. The protagonists of the novel go to some boarding schools every day. So Indian boarding schools began in 1860s, basically in the 1860s, and were opened off reservations and were meant basically to teach native children traditional education and assimilate them into mainstream culture. So this problem is well depicted in this novel. The US, example number two, the US, well, it's super difficult here to give only one title because there are so many kinds of ethnic literatures in the US that we could have a webinar only on this topic. I've chosen this one, American-born Chinese, because it's easy, so for lower levels as well. It's a graphic novel, so it's different from every other novel presented here. And there's a TV series on Disney+, so always for lower levels. So it's different, but it deals with the same topics, especially discrimination. Okay, and once again, a short summary. There's a Chinese boy. He's the only one American-born Chinese. Okay, in the school, and suddenly another one from Taiwan arrives in the school, and he doesn't want to be associated with. He calls him an FOB, fresh off boat, okay, because he wants to be considered an all-American boy. And you can work on the third space here, the hybridity we mentioned before, because a lot of characters in this novel wear masks to assimilate, to adapt to the mainstream culture. So it's a great work to work on this novel. Last one, the Caribbean. We have no time, unfortunately. We're not dealing with the historical background because yes, we only have a couple of minutes. But this novel speaks about a torturer, okay, during the regime of Papa Doc. So the book is actually a collection of short stories that can be read as a novel as well, because every single character in every single short story has a link with the dew breaker, so with the torturer, and they have to deal with their past. Memory is often a relevant topic in post-colonial literature. I'm thinking about my Shinsumani students, investigating the different types of memory. You have there a chart, you have there a table. It's super interesting with Shinsumani students because they study the same thing in psychology and human science. So as you can see there, Assmann, this is a work by Assmann, he distinguishes three types of memory. The individual memory, so I remember my name, I remember where I live, what I did yesterday. The communicative memory, so basically the memory of my family. I know something about my grandparents, even if I never met them, just because they're memories of my family, communicative, that were communicated, okay, passed down from generation to generation. And the last one is cultural memory, which is the memory we have from documents, monuments, text, official text, and so on. In this book, the three memories coexist because often in post-colonial literature, you see that the communicative memory, so the personal and communicative memory, is different from cultural memory. There's a clash between personal identity, family identity, original, let's say, identity, indigenous identity, and colonial identity. So it's a great work for human science students. At the very, very end of this webinar, I'd like to leave a question open. Many argue that the Western civilized world is repeating the same colonial behaviors with tourism, okay? Exploiting former colonies or poorer countries, large Western hotel chains, airlines, cruise ships, luxury villages. They control markets, okay? And they basically are contributing to social exclusion, okay? So I would like, this is a good starting point for colleagues who work in touristico. So you can start from this point, from tourism, and then you can go back to post-colonialism and colonialism and literature. So since we have no time, I will stop here. Now we will read some of your questions, but there's an extra slide for you with some extra ideas that you can browse online. You can find the you can find the summary of these books, but these are equally interesting books to use in class to speak about post-colonial literature. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and now we can read some of your questions. Ok.
No.
Allora, ho visto che c'è una domanda su come si possa mettere assieme tutto quello che è stato detto in questo webinar in un percorso interdisciplinare. Quindi in questo webinar sono state dette tante cose: storia, geografia, cultura, letteratura. Vero? Would you like to give an answer? Or would you like me to do it? I'll do it, ok. Allora, noi abbiamo provato, ovviamente è difficile, abbiamo provato a mettere insieme questo percorso nel CLIL, perché noi insegniamo insieme inglese, ma il mio collega insegna anche geografia. Quindi abbiamo provato, insieme anche ai colleghi di storia, di geostoria, a mettere insieme tutto questo in un CLIL, quindi partendo dalla storia dell'impero, quello che avete sentito all'inizio, quindi attraverso le mappe, storia, geostoria, storia e geografia, andando poi verso letteratura coloniale e postcoloniale. Certo, si può fare una parte abbastanza ridotta, non si può prendere in considerazione tutto e tutti, perché sennò prenderebbero tutte le lezioni dell'anno, però diciamo che con le lezioni fatte dal collega di storia, il collega di geografia e le nostre di inglese, in un 6-7 lezioni si riesce a coprire abbastanza bene tutto l'argomento. Ecco, tralasciando il grosso blocco, adesso parlo per letteratura inglese, tralasciando il grosso blocco di Conrad, A Passage to India e tutti loro, perché sennò non sarebbe assolutamente possibile. Ma parlando di eredità dell'impero e post-colonial literature, in 6-7 lezioni si riesce a fare tutto. Questa era la domanda che ho visto. Se non ci sono altre domande, abbiamo già sforato di 2 minuti, quindi vi ringraziamo, speriamo che queste cose possano tornarvi utili nelle vostre giornate a scuola, e visto che questo è l'ultimo appuntamento prima di Natale, vi auguriamo anche buon Natale e buona serata. Arrivederci.
Thank you very much. Good evening and good night.